The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and promise through the valley where Samuel Hayes knelt between rows of corn, his weathered hands pulling the last ears from stalks that had grown tall under his patient care. The harvest had been good, better than any he could remember in 15 years of working this land alone. His back ached from the dawn to dusk labor, but there was satisfaction in the weight of grain filling his storehouse, in the gold and amber husks that rustled like whispers of abundance. Samuel straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked across the fields toward the mountains, where smoke rose thin and grey from the Lakota camp. 3 miles away, maybe 4, close enough that he could sometimes hear their drums on still nights, far enough that most folks in Cedar Falls pretended they didn't exist. But Samuel had always been different from most folks. He had reasons for that, reasons carved deep into his conscience like furrows in turned earth. The town of Cedar Falls sprawled below his homestead, a collection of wooden buildings and painted signs that proclaimed civilization had come to stay. But Samuel knew better. He had seen what civilization could do when it came with rifles and righteous anger, when it decided that some lives mattered more than others. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw throbbed sometimes when the weather changed, a reminder of the day he had learned that being on the right side of history sometimes meant standing alone. That evening, as Samuel sat on his porch watching the sun bleed orange across the sky, he made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow was the Harvest Festival, the day when Cedar Falls celebrated another year of survival, another season of plenty. The whole town would gather in the square, sharing food and stories, and the comfortable certainty that they were safe, that they belonged. But as Samuel looked toward the smoke rising from the Lakota camp, he thought about belonging, about gratitude, about the faces of hunger he had seen in the eyes of the children who sometimes came to the edge of his fields. He stood up, decision crystallizing like frost on morning grass. He would invite them. He would invite Chief Running Bear and his people to the harvest feast. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the October air, because he knew what the town would say, what they would think. But the corn in his storehouse had grown from seeds given to him by an old Lakota woman 3 years ago, seeds that had survived drought and flood, that had fed him when his own crops failed. It was time to acknowledge that debt. The next morning, Samuel rode toward the Lakota camp with the kind of nervous energy that comes before a man does something he knows is right and dangerous. His horse, a patient gelding named Clay, picked his way carefully through the tall grass, and Samuel rehearsed the words he would say to Running Bear. The chief was a man of maybe 50 winters, with silver threading through his black hair and eyes that seemed to hold all the sadness of his people. Samuel had met him twice before, both times at the trading post, both times with the careful politeness of men who understood that they lived in a world where friendship could be fatal. The camp appeared gradually, teepees arranged in a circle around a central fire that had probably burned for generations. Children played at the edges, their laughter carrying on the wind like music. Women worked at stretching hides and tending to cook fires, their movements efficient and graceful. Men sat in small groups, some working on weapons, others simply talking in low voices. It was a scene of domestic peace that would have surprised most of the people in Cedar Falls, who had been taught to imagine savagery where there was only life. Running Bear emerged from the largest teepee as Samuel approached, his expression neither welcoming nor hostile, simply watchful. Samuel dismounted, removed his hat, and waited. The chief studied him for a long moment, taking in the nervous set of his shoulders, the way his hands worked at the brim of his hat. "You come with purpose," Running Bear said finally, his English careful but clear. Samuel nodded. "I do. My harvest is good this year, better than it's been in many seasons. Tomorrow is the day my people celebrate the harvest, and I—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like charity or condescension. "I would be honored if you and your people would join us. There will be food, music. It's a time of gratitude." Running Bear's expression didn't change, but Samuel caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the way the chief's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the knife at his belt. Around them, the camp had gone quiet, conversations stopping as people turned to listen. "Your people," Running Bear said slowly. "They know you make this invitation?" Samuel met his gaze steadily. "No, but it's my right to invite guests to a feast I'm helping to provide." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of history, of broken treaties and burned villages, of children who had learned to fear the sound of horses before they learned to walk. Running Bear looked past Samuel toward the town, visible in the distance as a cluster of buildings and smoke. "Why?" the chief asked finally. Samuel had expected this question, but the answer still came hard. "Because 3 years ago, when the drought killed my corn and I was facing winter with nothing, your grandmother gave me seeds. She said they were strong, that they would grow where others wouldn't. She was right. Those seeds saved my life, and now they've given me the best harvest I've ever had." He paused, his voice dropping. "And because I was at Sand Creek." The words fell like stones into still water. Running Bear's eyes sharpened, and Samuel saw the knowledge there, the understanding of what those words meant. Sand Creek, where Colonel Chivington had led his troops in a massacre that still haunted Samuel's dreams, where men had killed women and children and called it victory, where Samuel had refused to fire his rifle and been beaten unconscious by his own commander. "You were there," Running Bear said, and it wasn't a question. "I was there," Samuel confirmed, "and I've been trying to make up for it ever since." Running Bear studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward his tipi. Samuel waited, uncertain, while the chief disappeared inside. When he emerged, he was carrying a long pipe, its bowl carved from red stone and decorated with feathers and beads. "We will consider your invitation," Running Bear said formally. "But understand, Samuel Hayes, that if we come as ourselves. We will not pretend to be what we are not to make your people comfortable." Samuel nodded. "I wouldn't ask you to, and you understand that some of your people will not welcome us." "I understand." Samuel's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he replaced his hat. "The feast begins at noon. You would be welcome at my table." Running Bear raised the pipe toward the sky, then toward the earth, then toward the 4 directions. "We will consider," he said again. Samuel rode back to town with his heart hammering against his ribs, knowing that he had just set something in motion that he couldn't stop. The harvest festival was tomorrow, and he had no idea if he had just invited guests to a celebration or started a war. That evening, as the sun set over Cedar Falls, Samuel sat in the town's only saloon, nursing a whiskey and listening to the excited chatter about tomorrow's festivities. Mayor Patterson held court at the bar, his voice booming about the success of the harvest, the growth of the town, the bright future that lay ahead. Sheriff Morrison sat at a corner table, his badge catching the lamplight, his eyes constantly scanning the room with the vigilance of a man who expected trouble. "Sam!" Mayor Patterson called out, noticing him for the first time. "Heard you had a good harvest this year. That corn of yours is the talk of the county." Samuel raised his glass in acknowledgement. "Been blessed," he said simply. "Blessed by hard work and American ingenuity," Patterson declared, and the men around him nodded approvingly. "That's what built this town, what'll keep it strong. Hard work and keeping to our own kind." Samuel took a long drink, tasting the whiskey's burn and the bitter irony of Patterson's words. He thought about the Lakota grandmother who had given him the seeds, about the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of her people about which plants would grow in difficult soil, about the hands that had carefully saved and selected and preserved the varieties that now filled his storehouse. "What if I told you," Samuel said carefully, "that my success this year came from help I didn't expect?" Patterson laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Sam, you're too modest. You worked that land yourself, sun up to sundown. Nobody helped you but your own 2 hands." Samuel met his eyes across the smoky room. "But what if they did? What if someone I never would have expected gave me exactly what I needed when I needed it most? The laughter died in Patterson's throat. Around them, conversations slowed as men turned to listen. Sheriff Morrison's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his gun. "What are you saying, Sam?" Patterson asked, his voice suddenly cold. Samuel finished his whiskey and stood up. "I'm saying tomorrow's a day for gratitude, for acknowledging our debts, for remembering that we don't survive alone." He walked out of the saloon into the cool night air, leaving behind a room full of men who watched him go with suddenly suspicious eyes. As he made his way home through the darkened streets, Samuel wondered if he had just made his last appearance in Cedar Falls social circles. Morning came with frost on the grass and a clarity to the air that made everything seem sharp and significant. Samuel woke before dawn, as he had every day for 15 years, and went through his morning routine with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned that routine was the only thing that stood between him and the chaos of memory. He fed his animals, checked his fences, and tried not to think about the decision he had made, the invitation he had extended. By 10 o'clock, the town square was bustling with activity. Women in their finest dresses arranged tables laden with food, roasted turkey and ham, cornbread and apple pie, preserves and pickled vegetables. Children ran between the tables, their excitement infectious, their laughter bright as birdsong. Men gathered in small groups, smoking pipes and talking about crops and weather and the price of cattle. Samuel arrived carrying a large basket of corn, ears still in their husks, golden and perfect. He set it on the main table and stepped back, watching as Mrs. Patterson admired the size and quality of the ears. "Samuel Hayes," she said, her voice carrying across the square, "this is the finest corn I've ever seen. You should be proud." Samuel nodded his thanks, but his eyes were on the road that led from town toward the mountains. No sign of dust, no indication that anyone was coming. For a moment, he felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Maybe Running Bear had decided against coming. Maybe it was better this way. But then he saw them. They came not as a war party, not as the savage horde that existed in the nightmares of Cedar Falls, but as a family. Running Bear rode at the front, his posture dignified and calm, dressed in his finest clothes. A shirt of soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork, leggings fringed with symbols that told the story of his people, a headdress of eagle feathers that caught the morning sun. Behind him came his wife, a woman of quiet beauty whose name Samuel had never learned, and their daughter, a girl of maybe 16 with her mother's gentle eyes and her father's proud bearing. But it was what they brought that made the entire town fall silent. The Lakota didn't come empty-handed. They brought gifts that spoke of a generosity that most of the white settlers had never imagined possible. A travois pulled by a painted horse carried bundles of the finest furs Samuel had ever seen. Beaver and fox and buffalo robes, so soft they seemed to glow in the autumn light. There were baskets woven from sweetgrass and willow, so perfectly crafted they looked like works of art. Beadwork that must have taken months to complete, each piece telling a story in colors that seemed to hold the very essence of the prairie. And food. They brought food that transformed the harvest feast from a simple community gathering into something approaching a banquet. Wild rice that had been gathered from hidden lakes, seasoned with herbs that grew only in the mountains, dried meat that had been prepared with spices that made Samuel's mouth water from 20 feet away, squash and beans and corn prepared in ways that the white settlers had never imagined. Dishes that spoke of centuries of knowledge and tradition. But most shocking of all was the bundle that Running Bear carried himself. A collection of seeds, each variety carefully preserved and labeled with symbols that told their history. Seeds that had fed his people through famines and droughts, that had been saved and protected and passed down through generations of grandmothers who understood that the future lived in the potential of every saved grain. The town square had gone completely quiet. Children stopped playing, women stopped talking. Men stood with their mouths open, staring at this display of abundance and artistry that challenged everything they thought they knew about the savages who lived in the mountains. Samuel stepped forward, his heart pounding, and walked toward Running Bear. The chief dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life on horseback, and the two men faced each other in the center of the square. "You came," Samuel said, his voice carrying in the silence. "We came," Running Bear replied. "We brought gifts for the harvest feast. It is our way." Samuel looked at the travois, at the careful arrangement of furs and baskets and food, at the evidence of hours of preparation and thought. This is too much. I invited you to share our food, not to bring your own." Running Bear's expression was patient, almost amused. "Among my people, when we are invited to celebrate abundance, we bring abundance. We do not come as beggars to your table. We come as equals, with our own gifts to share." Behind Samuel, the town was beginning to stir. He could hear whispered conversations, the rustle of skirts as women moved closer to see the gifts the Lakota had brought. Mayor Patterson was making his way through the crowd, his face red with confusion and something that might have been anger. "Samuel," Patterson said, his voice tight with control, "what exactly is happening here?" Samuel turned to face him, acutely aware that the entire town was watching, that his next words would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the fate of the peaceful people who had accepted his invitation. "I invited Chief Running Bear and his family to join our harvest celebration," Samuel said clearly. "They've brought gifts to share with everyone." Patterson's eyes swept over the travois, taking in the value of what he saw there. Samuel could almost see the calculations running through his mind, the worth of those furs, the craftsmanship of the baskets, the abundance of food. This wasn't what any of them had expected from the poor savages they had been taught to fear and pity. These are fine goods," Patterson said slowly. Running Bear stepped forward, his dignity intact despite the scrutiny. "We bring what we can to honor the harvest. It is a sacred time when the earth gives up her gifts to sustain us through the cold months." An elderly woman named Mrs. Carson, who had been eyeing the beadwork with the appreciation of someone who understood fine craftsmanship, stepped closer. "Did you make these yourself?" she asked, addressing Running Bear's wife. The woman nodded, her English limited but clear. "I make with my daughter. Take many moons, we hope you like." "Mrs." Carson reached out tentatively and touched one of the beaded bags, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns. "It's beautiful. I've never seen work this fine." That simple moment of recognition seemed to break something in the frozen tableau of the town square. Other women began to move closer, drawn by curiosity and the undeniable beauty of the gifts. Children, who had been hiding behind their mothers' skirts, began to edge forward, their natural curiosity overcoming their learned fear. Sheriff Morrison appeared at Samuel's elbow, his hand resting on his gun. "Sam, what are you trying to prove here?" Samuel met his gaze steadily. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm trying to give thanks. This family helped me when I needed it most. Now I want to share what I have with them." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "You're taking a hell of a risk. People here don't take kindly to mixing with Indians." "These aren't Indians," Samuel said, his voice carrying to the crowd around them. "These are my neighbors, and they're my guests." The word neighbors rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Samuel could see the shock on faces around him, the way people recoiled from the idea that the Lakota were anything more than obstacles to be removed or enemies to be fought. But Running Bear's daughter chose that moment to approach a group of white children who had been staring at her with wide eyes. She held out a small doll, beautifully carved from wood and dressed in traditional clothing, and offered it to a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "For you," she said in careful English, "I make for your harvest day." The little girl looked up at her mother for permission, then reached out with both hands to accept the gift. She hugged the doll to her chest and smiled up at Running Bear's daughter with the uncomplicated joy that only children can manage. "Thank you," she whispered, She's beautiful." Samuel watched that exchange and felt something shift in the air around the square. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. A crack in the wall of fear and suspicion that had separated the two communities for so long. Mayor Patterson cleared his throat, clearly struggling to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly moving beyond his comprehension. "Well," he said loudly, "I suppose if Samuel vouches for these people, we can try to make them welcome." It wasn't exactly a warm invitation, but it was acceptance of a sort. Samuel felt a rush of relief mixed with anxiety. The hardest part was over, but the day was far from finished. As the formal part of the feast began, Samuel found himself watching the interactions between his two worlds, with the fascination of a man witnessing history in the making. The Lakota family moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, sharing their food, admiring the white settlers' contributions, responding to questions with patience and grace. Running Bear found himself in conversation with several of the town's farmers, discussing crop rotation and soil preservation, with the expertise of a man who had spent his life working the land. His wife demonstrated the preparation of wild rice to a group of fascinated women, while their daughter played with the local children, language barriers disappearing in the universal language of games and laughter. But it was the seeds that truly captured everyone's attention. Running Bear opened the bundle he had carried and began to explain each variety. Corn that could grow in drought conditions, beans that could survive early frost, squash that could be stored for months without spoiling. He spoke of his grandmother's grandmother, who had selected and saved these seeds through seasons of plenty and scarcity, who had understood that the survival of the people depended on the preservation of the plants that fed them. Mrs. Patterson, who prided herself on her garden, leaned forward with genuine interest. "You mean these varieties are hardier than what we've been growing?" "Much hardier," Running Bear confirmed. "My people have been selecting for strength for many generations. These seeds carry the memory of surviving when others fail." Samuel watched as understanding dawned on the faces around him. These weren't primitive people clinging to an obsolete way of life. They were master agriculturalists who had been working this land for centuries, who had developed techniques and varieties that could teach the white settlers valuable lessons about survival and success. As the afternoon wore on, the barriers between the two groups continued to erode. Children who had been taught to fear the Lakota found themselves fascinated by the stories Running Bear told about the animals of the mountains. Women who had never imagined that savages could create anything of beauty found themselves admiring the intricate beadwork and asking questions about the techniques involved. The men, perhaps, were the most surprised of all. They had expected to meet warriors, fighters, the dangerous enemies they had been warned about. Instead, they found themselves talking to farmers and craftsmen, fathers and husbands, men who shared their concerns about weather and crops and the future of their children. Sheriff Morrison, who had been watching the proceedings with obvious tension, finally relaxed enough to accept a piece of the seasoned venison that Running Bear's wife had prepared. The flavor was unlike anything he had tasted before, and his expression of surprise and pleasure was evident to everyone watching. "This is remarkable," he said, looking directly at her. "What did you use to season it?" She smiled, pleased by his appreciation, and began to describe the combination of herbs and spices she had used, many of which grew wild in the mountains, but were unknown to the white settlers. As she spoke, Samuel could see other people listening, taking mental notes, beginning to understand that the Lakota possessed knowledge that could be valuable to them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the formal feast drew to a close. But instead of the polite but distant farewells Samuel had expected, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Carson approached Running Bear's wife with a bundle of her own. "I want you to have this," she said, holding out a quilt that Samuel recognized as one of her finest works. "It's not much compared to what you've brought, but it's made with love." The Lakota woman accepted the quilt with obvious pleasure, running her hands over the careful stitching and admiring the pattern. "Is beautiful," she said. "I treasure always." Other people began to come forward, offering their own gifts. A jar of honey from the town's beekeeper, a bottle of whiskey from the saloon keeper, a small wooden toy carved by one of the men for Running Bear's daughter. The gifts were simple, but they were offered with genuine warmth, and Samuel could see the surprise and pleasure on the faces of his Lakota guests. Mayor Patterson, who had been watching these exchanges with growing amazement, finally stepped forward. "Chief Running Bear," he said formally, "I want to thank you for coming today. Your gifts have been educational. Perhaps we could arrange for more exchanges between our communities." Running Bear nodded gravely. "We would welcome friendship with our neighbors. There is much we could learn from each other." As the Lakota family prepared to leave, loading their travois with the gifts they had received in return, Samuel felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The day had been a success beyond his wildest hopes, but he knew that the real work was just beginning. Running Bear approached him as the family prepared to mount their horses. "You have done a brave thing today, Samuel Hayes. Not all your people were ready to see us as we are, but you helped them begin." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of what had happened. "It's just the beginning," he said. "There's a lot of fear and mistrust to overcome." "Fear comes from not knowing," Running Bear replied. "Today, they began to know us. That is how healing starts." As the Lakota family rode away into the gathering dusk, Samuel stood in the town square, surrounded by his neighbors, all of them changed by what they had experienced. The harvest feast had become something none of them had expected. A bridge between two worlds, a first step toward understanding. But Samuel knew that the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead. Would the connections made today survive the return to normal life? Would the prejudices and fears that had separated the communities reassert themselves? Or would this brief moment of understanding grow into something more permanent? Mrs. Patterson approached him as he stood lost in thought. "Samuel," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I had no idea. They're not what I expected." Samuel looked at her, seeing the confusion and genuine curiosity in her eyes. "They're people, Mrs. Patterson. Just people trying to live their lives and take care of their families." She nodded slowly. "I see that now. And those seeds. My husband is already talking about trying to get some to plant next year." Samuel smiled. "I think that can be arranged." "Udi." As the evening deepened and the townspeople began to clean up from the feast, Samuel found himself thinking about the seeds Running Bear had brought. Each variety represented generations of careful selection and preservation, a living library of knowledge that could help all of them survive and thrive in this sometimes harsh land. But more than that, they represented hope. Hope that two peoples who'd been taught to fear and hate each other could find common ground. Hope that understanding could grow like seeds in good soil, spreading and taking root, creating something new and strong. The harvest feast of 1876 would be remembered in Cedar Falls for generations to come. Not just as the day when the Lakota came to town, but as the day when a community began to understand that their survival depended not on isolation and fear, but on the wisdom and generosity of all the people who called this land home. Samuel walked home through the quiet streets, his heart full of gratitude and hope. The harvest had been good, but the real gift had been the opportunity to plant seeds of understanding that might, with care and patience, grow into something beautiful. As he looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, he thought about the grandmother who had given him seeds 3 years ago, and he whispered a prayer of thanks for the abundance that came not from the earth alone, but from the willingness of people to share their gifts with strangers who might become friends. The moon was rising over the mountains, casting its silver light on a world that had changed, perhaps imperceptibly, but changed nonetheless. And in that change, Samuel found reason to believe that the harvest season was not ending, but beginning anew.